Taylor Swift, the first phase of her work, and it still exists a little bit, was the anger toward boyfriends and switching relations. That was sort of the subject of those first couple albums. And you could say that's an adolescent, but that's also true for the Beatles, that they wrote 42 songs that are about I love you and want to hold your hand before they wrote anything we actually like or remember. So, but here's the thing, I hadn't listened to her closely up until maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And then Carole King, who's one of the greatest living songwriters, said that she was a kind of preternaturally skillful songwriter. And I thought, oh my God, if Carole King thinks that, I guess I missed something. So I went and listened to her albums kind of in a sequence. And I think she is a very clever, talented person. She's not some offhanded random. She's a very self-conscious artist. And, so yeah, I think Taylor Swift is somewhere in the canon of songwriters that,
yeah.
Not that she needs my vote to get by, but. My specialty is 18th century and some 17th century topics, British poetry, British literature. That's what I've written about primarily. But my role here is really not in teaching 18th century because it rarely is offered in the actual department. So I'm a kind of permanent visitor, if you imagine that role. So I kind of play the auxiliary role in the department. If they need a survey, if they need any kind of what I think of as service course, I do those courses. So I do major British writers, and this semester I'm doing the literary theory course. So I do what's required, what's necessary. And I think freshman courses and survey courses are more significant or important in the development of students than smaller boutique seminars, and so I don't mind doing that kind of work. I teach FWS, like all of my colleagues teach at least one FWS, so that's a departmental agreement. And I teach a course called Writing About Poetry, which is it's a mixture of a composition course, how to write expository prose, and how to read poems. So I go through a process of teaching them how to understand meter, rhyme, rhythm, stanza structures. It's like a building block course. At the same time, we write papers at various lengths. It's an introduction, but I try to stress the non-thematic elements of the poem, what the poem sounds like, why it's a work of art, and why, so yeah, I've been teaching that course. There are two obvious reasons. One thing is that poetry is, to me, the most important part of my own broader knowledge. I mean, I've been interested in poems of all kinds since I was, I started as a classics major, but even there I was interested in Latin and Greek poetry primarily. And it kind of built an interest in poetry. I also wrote poems over my life, so I've been involved, poetry and song, popular song or otherwise, it's been sort of the central interest of my life. Only secondarily did I get interested in history of ideas and philosophy, but that became a parallel track. But to me, poetry and song is the essence of my central interest in this profession. My father, who was an attorney, he was a district attorney, prosecutor, he was an admirer of poetry, and he read it to us once or twice a week at dinner. After dinner, my brother, who became a very famous scientist, who died doing his research many years ago, he was one of the most famous ornithologists and ecologists of the 20th century. He didn't like the poems that much. He was distracted thinking about other things, but I was very taken by it from the very beginning. And I found that I could remember poems without much work. So that by the time I was in college, I probably knew about 150 poems or something by heart, I would guess, something like that. Since then, a lot more. But it was a natural interest of mine. I even liked the way the poems sounded before I knew what they meant. So I could enjoy, Eliot says, T.S. said it, that you can enjoy a poem in a foreign language that you don't understand if you can hear it, which I think is actually kind of true if you have that kind of. So from the very beginning, when I was very small, I really enjoyed poetry. I thought it was very important. Who knows why, and it never changed since that time. And so, And one other thing, you asked a question. You would kind of ask a question, why is it important, or what, you know.
Yeah.
I did a video. I occasionally do videos online, which not too many people listen to it. There's a sort of small audience. And I argued that mathematics and poetry are the two most valuable cognitive exercises that a person can, because the most complex verbal structures are poetic, and the most complex rational structures are mathematical. So I think that if those two things are probably the two things that are most essential to human cognitive growth. That's what I would guess, because we think of verbal and numerical or quantitative as separate, and so I think poetry has a very special place in that way.
No, that makes sense. And I think that especially because of the kind of value that poetry can bring to people, it makes sense to introduce it like early on to freshmen, so that way they can become more comfortable and like acclimated to it, because poetry is very intimidating for a lot of people. And so do you think that's like part of the goal of one of your classes as well?
Unfortunately, there's a thing we all know about, and which I call poetryphobia. And that comes from the fact, I'm not sure exactly the history of poetryphobia. I think it comes from the fact that people read a poem and think they're missing something. And they may be missing something, but they have a strong anxiety about missing something. And this is because in high school and elsewhere, poems are treated like they're riddles or deep problems that suggest something and therefore you can miss it, because it's like, I think that's a very bad way to read and think about poems. That's why I emphasize the beautiful construction of the poem rhythmically and everything, which produces a kind of pleasure and interest of its own, and then you work your way to the thematic and the intellectual side of the poem. You got to break down people's resistance a little bit. And also poetry is no longer culturally central and significant, because we're flooded with sensoria from recorded music, film, online material. And so poetry, which was a hugely public element of our culture in the 19th century, no longer has that role. So it's almost becoming like reading Latin and Greek to read poems. So unfortunately, but I try to give people an entree so that they can maybe in some imaginary future enjoy reading poems. Well, they've already been reading poems in high school or junior high as statements they have to interpret, but they haven't been reading them as compositions. Yeah. I mean, I say to them, if you hear a piece by Mozart or a Beatles song or something, people enjoy it. They don't say, well, what does it mean? I'm lost. There are plenty of people who listen to a Beatles song or a Stones song or a Creedence song. They actually don't know what it means. They don't care, because they've gotten into this rhythmic, melodic territory which draws them in. Poetry has some of those same qualities if you have a habit of hearing it, I guess.
Because even as you were describing some of the process, it sounds like the way people interpret song lyrics.
Right.
And you have actually had some moderate success in writing songs in the past, and you see
very moderate.
Well, that's still impressive. That's still impressive. So can you talk about how you see songwriting as well as writing poetry and even interpreting songs and interpreting poetry? How are they similar? Because I feel right now people have a conception of them as separate.
Well, popular songs that are sophisticated or that are interesting usually have interesting lyrics, and often that actually is really the sign of the highest achievement in popular songwriting, the degree to which the lyric and the harmonic and melodic structures are coordinated in an interesting way. There are people who don't ever remember the words of a song, and that's a very interesting problem, but I think that the reason people prize not only the Beatles and Dylan, but Cole Porter and songs from the American Songbook is that they have elaborate, sophisticated, tricky lyrics. And the other thing is I always talk about this. I saw an interview with Billy Joel at the public library years ago, and Billy Joel said something that most people don't realize. He said the great songwriters, and he was including McCartney and Dylan and many Elvis Costello, those people have metrical ingenuity. It's not just metrical meaning musical time. They know about accents of the words in the lyric. They know which words are the key words in lines and which have vocal accent. So they really have the skill that a poet has in metrical arrangement. And that's something they all share. I think the best songwriter. I don't think you can be a great songwriter without that. So there's a very close connection between book poetry and songwriting, I think. Rap is even more, because rap is basically just a rhythm track with spoken or intuned speech. So that shows the instinct to preserve poetry, rap.
Yeah.
It's really the desire to preserve the poetic conventions and traditions of rhyme and alliterative effects and all kinds of, rap kind of proves there's an economy of poetry in history, as it were. It doesn't go away. I think that poetry by professional poets, the poetry culture, has declined somewhat since 1980. I think there's a kind of decline, and I won't go into why that's true, but I think pop songwriters and hip-hop people have kind of taken up the slack in the natural public interest in poetic devices, and so it's a very important cultural fact that there's a kind of decline on one side of poetry production and a kind of, there's a balance. You can say, if you look at the pop charts and the pop culture since 1975-80, is that it's gone from a strongly male-oriented and dominant composing and songwriting group to a female, because the diva culture also includes 4 or 5 of the best songwriters in the last 25 years, and it's kind of shifted. Male bands now seem relatively trivial in their self-presentation, but you have a whole group and that wasn't true in the 60s. There was an enormous masculine domination of song making, aside from, Grace Slick and Joni Mitchell, and it was almost unbelievably male dominated, not just the songwriting, but the attitude of the songs of the 60s and early 70s is this kind of, so that's it. I don't know if people talk about that much, but to me, if you're interested in a feminist history or something, then pop songwriting is one of the places you can see a real independent development of women's composition and women's performance. So, I think it's the first period when women dominated popular music, along with actually 2 things: black artists and women. It's paradoxical, because of hip hop on one side, and then what I call diva culture, which is a hugely important part of music in this later period. So. Well, no one can deny it has a shrinking place in the public sphere, and if I'm looking at the 19th century politicians in Britain and America, they knew poems and they quoted things on the floor of the House or House of Commons, and that was part of the proving your pedigree as a gentleman or whatever. I think all of that has disappeared from. You can't imagine the present members of the House of Representatives quoting Milton to make a point about, it's just, so that part of poetic culture is passé. So, it unfortunately, in my opinion, it doesn't have quite the centrality it once had. That doesn't mean it's not intrinsically valuable. So, many things of intrinsic value are not particularly loved by mankind. So there is a sort of backdoor energy of poetry, but if you mean poetry in the canon of English and American writers, that's I'm afraid that's in a very precipitous decline of importance, unfortunately.
So I guess just as an ending for this longer interview, what would you say to students who want to get into learning poetry, or not learning, reading poetry, writing it, how would you encourage them to partake in that and make it seem less intimidating?
Well, I think the first step is finding poems and poets that you really like and feel an attachment to, and learning them very thoroughly, internalizing them. I said to my students the other day in class, they were saying, they imagine if Wordsworth or Milton is writing iambic pentameter lines, they think that they have a thought and then they turn it into the poem, but that's not true. They think in iambic pentameter. Those guys, their thoughts they had done so long practicing this art, It was no different than Mozart finding a melody by just playing spontaneously on the keyboard. That's how, he played by ear just like anybody else. And so you have to internalize something. You have to make it part of your actual, an automatic. And it's hard to do, but it's easier if you have a personal attachment to the author. And so you can start there and work forward. But, we'll see how many people do that.